Let's get started. We have been publishing our annual candidate experience report now for a number of years, but last year was actually the first time that we presented it during a webinar, and that was just such a success that it was a no-brainer to do that again. So here we are together in this little podcast studio, actually. So the sound must be excellent. If there's any issue, just let us know. I'm here with Chris Laumans.
Hello, everyone.
He's
Happy to
our
be here.
lead data analyst here at Start, who has been doing a lot of number crunching in the past weeks, sitting right across of me in this podcast studio. So, Chris, maybe a little word of introduction to the audience.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Laumans, lead data analyst at Start. Very happy to share with you today's findings for the 2023 Candidate Experience Benchmark Report. But first, Mark will set the stage.
Thank you. My name is Mark Berendsen. I'm co-founder of Start, and we will share our LinkedIn profiles in the chat function. And we love to connect with you. So let it go during the webinar and start right away. And also use the chat for any comments that you want to make or questions you want to ask during the webinar. We'll make sure to either take them directly or anyhow during the Q&A at the end of the session. We're so excited that you're all interested and registered in large amounts to learn more about the Candidate Experience 2023 benchmark results. And let's face it, it is very important in talent acquisition to provide a good candidate experience. So you want to be successful, and today we'll show you what good looks like. Please know that we will publish the report tomorrow. Tomorrow it will be in your email boxes, but today you'll hear the results already. We're going to share a lot of numbers, but don't worry, we'll try to give as much meaning to those results as possible. We're also going to talk about qualitative results, meaning that we analyze textual comments given by the candidates when they give feedback. So that is also going to be super exciting. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about the year at Start 2023. We had a very exciting and eventful year as we've merged with Talent Hub. Talent Hub is a company based in Copenhagen, Denmark. And believe it or not, they have the same passion for candidate experience. We're now all colleagues. We've officially joined forces since September last year. We're now stronger together to provide you great candidate-centric solutions. So candidate centricity is our crucial joint mission. And please watch the space as there will be interesting announcements coming very soon. It's important to say that the data of Start and Talent Hub are not yet combined for the year 2023. We've looked into it, but concluded that it wouldn't be possible to look at it on a like-for-like basis. But Chris will share a bit more about that comparison that we've made. So anyhow, it will be interesting for Talent Hub users too to stay in this webinar because it is absolutely insightful. So a very warm welcome to you as well. Our benchmark report is actually the most important piece of content that we publish. So why is it so important? Because you have to know where you stand, right? It will give meaning to your data. It will show you what good looks like. So either you're behind on the benchmark and then you need to invest in better candidate experience to catch up and hit your hiring goals. And this investment could be, include more staff or training courses or a particular new technology in your budget. Or you're ahead of the benchmark, which of course is a great proof point to your leadership that you've created a competitive advantage in recruitment with your team and truly operate in a candidate-centric way. But candidate experience, what is it? It means so much. Everything is candidate experience, from the job ad, career page, to every interaction that a candidate had with recruitment, but also the wider organization in general. Even the survey you sent after the process could be considered as part of the candidate experience. So at Start, we want to make sense out of all those feelings and perceptions and opinions and turn those opinions into data. That's what we do. And visualize the data so that you can act on the insights they provide. And ultimately, and that's the goal, improve your candidate experience. So what are we going to do? What is on our agenda this morning? The main item, of course, is the benchmark data for the year 2023. We will share the full detail of the results, but first we want to set the stage. How was 2023? What have been the major trends and developments in the economy at a very high level? So those insights are basically context with looking at the numbers. Then we want to talk about why measure candidate experience, what are the benefits, and of course, how and when to measure. We'll be talking about candidate net promoter score. We call it CNPS. So we'll make sure to explain the fundamentals to everyone, so everyone is on the same page with regards to that core metric. And then Chris will take over and give you the benchmark report data filtered on company size, department, which is more or less a grouping of different types of jobs, on country, on application source, very detailed. Plus, we'll share, as said, also an insight on textual comments based on machine learning analysis of almost 100,000 comments made by candidates on our platform. We will also talk about response rates, because we strongly believe that response rates are not just an important metric that determines the data that you'll have, but also is indicative of the engagement a candidate had with the application process and your company in general. Finally, we have an exclusive also in this webinar, and that is the score of the hiring manager. So basically, how does the hiring manager score the partnership with recruitment? And I'm pretty sure you want to learn that number, so stay tuned. We're hoping to make this an interactive hour. So if you have any questions, please use the chat feature of this webinar. And we want to start also interactive. So we want to know a little bit more about you. And therefore, we'll do a short poll. And the question is very simple. Does your organization measure candidate experience? Which can be a very fancy solution like Start or Talent Hub, or your built-in feature in your ATS, or even manually sending out forms. Anything goes. Do you measure candidate experience? Yes or no? Or do you have this on your roadmap for 2024? So go ahead, fill in the poll, and we'll get back to the results in a minute. But first, we want to set the stage. How was 2023 from an economy point of view and from a labor market point of view? And we'll take a step back and zoom out. First of all, there was, of course, inflation. The picture we're showing is that of high inflation. Last year, around about 10%, it gone down. That's the blue line. But the point we're making here is that we still experience a way higher price level. We're still shocked by high prices, right? Everywhere around us. So inflation might have come down. We're still experiencing what is called cumulative inflation. And that has a major consequence for labor, of course. Think about the implication it has on salaries. Wages are still behind. Effectively, people have lower purchasing power and higher wages can be expected. So a survey in the US actually shows that employers are planning to increase overall wages in 2024 by 4%. And how does that affect unemployment? Unemployment is still at records low. Like last year, however, we see a small uptick at the end of last year. And the question is, how will unemployment develop in this year, 2024? Unemployment, or put differently, talent shortage, is still a big phenomenon. This research is done by Manpower, and that's the next slide. One second. Now we have to go back a couple of slides. This research is done by Manpower, and it shows companies that are reporting talent shortages becoming an increasingly bigger problem. We thought in 2022 we hit a high of 75%, but it even increased to 77%. So more than 3 out of 4 businesses now report difficulty finding the talent they need. But aren't we seeing any changes? Yes, we do. and that is vacancy rates. These are vacancy rates, and that's the number of vacancies in an industry as the percentage of the total number of jobs in that particular industry. They all came down, except for IT, education, and federal government. And a lower number of vacancies could indicate, of course, change. However, there's no real prediction of increased unemployment yet. And finally, we want to focus on the tech sector because in 2022, we saw, of course, a lot of announcements of layoffs in tech. People were looking at layoffs.fyi regularly, and that's where this picture comes from. But that has continued in 2023. Actually, there have been more layoffs in 2023 than the year before. But overall, the tech industry is actually quite healthy because the good news is that despite layoffs, the new hires outweigh those in real life. We already saw the increased vacancy rate in IT, and in total, the tech workforce had a 3% increase year on year. So keep in mind when looking at the numbers of the benchmark report, increasing cumulative inflation, probable that wages go up, low employment with high talent shortages, just small signs of change when we look at the lower vacancy rates. And finally, layoffs in tech continue, but the tech industry as a whole is growing last year 3% year on year. So why candidate experience? I already said at start, we are passionate about candidate experience. So let me tell you why it's so important, keeping the trends just discussed in mind. And these are three major reasons. The first, there's more demand than supply currently in the labor market. So attracting the right talent is crucial for you as an organization. Why would you apply with your company? So your reputation as an employer is super important. Great candidate experience will contribute to that good reputation. I mean, it's word of mouth. People talk about this. And ultimately, it's more or less, your Glassdoor rating.
All right, apologies for that, everyone. We're going to switch the setup here, move next to each other. Mark's going to take it from here.
Everybody hearing me? I hope. So let's continue. I was telling about when candidates are also your customers. Of course, that is an issue when they leave you as a candidate and also as a customer. So you want to prevent that from happening. Okay. I was happy enough to just take a picture of this billboard when I saw it. I wasn't driving, so don't worry. It says, you can't improve what you don't measure. And that's also true. So to us, it's actually start measuring so you know what to improve. Unfortunately, especially in candidate experience, for a lot of companies, this is still a black box. But let's find out how that is in our audience. We see, and this is, of course, not a representative audience, because for obvious reasons, we have a lot of customers present as well. So it is 71. Yeah.
Yeah, 82% response rate, 71% of which do measure candidate experience, 15% have it on their roadmap for 2024, and 11 do not measure it and are not yet, or maybe have it on the roadmap for 2025 or further in the future.
Okay, this definitely looks like a group of people that are measuring in large amounts. So that is cool. So uncover the invisible to know where the problems are. And your candidates are happy to tell you, by the way, because the proof point of that is high response rates. We'll show you later. Then how to measure. In essence, a survey will be sent once there is an outcome automatically by your ATS at the moment that there is an outcome for that particular candidate. So getting the right survey at the right time to the right candidate. And rich data pulled from your ATS will then give you real-time analytics. And they could look like this. So the big number that is showing up there is the candidate net promoter score. So we talk about Net Promoter Score, but then of course for the candidates, the question is, based on your application experience, how likely are you to recommend this organization to others? And the score goes from very unlikely to very likely. Let me show you. We are going to neglect the passives in the middle, 7 and 8. We're going to focus on the promoters, the 9s and the 10s, and 0, 2, and including 6, who are the detractors. And then basically a percentage of promoters minus a percentage of detractors will give you the Net Promoter Score. So in this example, we have 32% promoters and 18% detractors, which gives us a Net Promoter Score of 14. Looks pretty positive to me, but how do we know it's good or bad? Now we need a benchmark. So let's have a look. It's not that good. 14 is compared to 32, which is the benchmark, in this case, for candidates that have withdrawn from the process. So there is room for improvement, and your deeper analytics will show you how you can improve that. So one final remark before I hand over to Chris, and that is about when to measure. As you can see, the Net Promoter Score is very different from candidates that have been rejected versus withdrawn and especially hired. So it's always good to talk about a benchmark within a specific stage. We always do that. And even within that stage, for example, rejected, there are multiple touch points that you can talk about. So rejected after application or screening, after phone screen, after assessment, or after interview. Please keep that in mind. And finally, we only ask once for feedback, and that is at the very end of the process when there is an outcome for that individual candidate. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Chris. I'm going to fix my microphone meanwhile, and for you to present the results of the 2023 benchmark report.
Thank you very much, Mark, for setting the stage. Once again, my name is Chris Laumans, lead data analyst at Start. I'll be taking you through the benchmark insights. As Mark mentioned, the benchmark report will be available tomorrow. In today's webinar, we're going to cover just some highlights, the full details. If you have quite a want to know a particular data point, likely you'll be able to find it in the report itself. But once again, today we'll focus on maybe some of the more interesting things that stood out to us. Concerning the data, this is 2023 data for Start customers. We had collected more than 200,000 responses from candidates, also more than 100,000 comments, which we'll discuss in the comment data later. The criteria for a company to be included in the benchmark report was that they needed to have at least 100 responses in the year 2023. And they needed to have at least 20 responses for any reported metric. So for example, later we'll break down the data by country. What you may see then is that will only include companies who for a particular country had 20 responses. Most importantly, the NPS is calculated per company and then averaged. And the importance of this is that large companies are given equal weight to small companies. Hence, the numbers you'll see are not skewed due to maybe one particularly large company who has had many responses. Before we get into the data, I need to give a little bit of an explainer. It might be useful. Some of the figures that we're going to present using something called a box plot. A box plot is a way to present data that gives more information than only the average. Besides showing you the average, it also shows you how distributed the data is, and hence you see the total range. To create a box plot, what we do is we take the NPS scores. Let's say we have a particular data point. We have 12 companies, and they have the following NPSs. We can sort those from low to high. So you see at the left, -52, and at the right, 37. And to create a box plot, what you do is we divide those, in this case, 12 companies or NPS scores into 4 quartiles. And this gives the distribution of the data. In the middle, you see a box. That is where the middle 50% of companies, score. But the whiskers at the end show you the range. As well, you're also in this, we'll see the average and the median. The average will be drawn as a dot, and the median just is the line in the middle. The whiskers show you the full range. So in this case, you can see that although the average is maybe a 10 or a -10, we see that the range is, for example, -50 to 37. I'll be sure to add additional context when we come across these box plots. The agenda for today. We'll be looking at the NPS. This will be broken down by stage, country, company, size, department, and source. We'll be looking at response rates. We'll also go into the comment analysis. And lastly, we'll have an exclusive concerning the hiring managers' insights. All right. Moving into the good stuff, the data. As Mark mentioned, Start and Talent Hub merged. We unfortunately were unable to fully incorporate the Talent Hub data into this benchmark report, but I just want to share one slide showing the numbers from the Talent Hub customer base and from the Start customer base next to one another. So at the left, you see the numbers for Talent Hub, and at the right for Start, broken down by stage, rejected, withdrawn, and hired. For Talent Hub customers, we see NPS scores of -18, 20, and 84. And for Start, -5, 39, and 80. So what you see here is that the hired NPS scores are comparable, around 80 and 84. What we see is also that the big difference is in the rejected and withdrawn, where Talent Hub customers have lower NPS scores. There are two possible explanations for this. Firstly, a difference in the customers of the two companies. Start has more US-based companies who in general give higher NPS ratings, or candidates who give higher NPS scores than the European counterparts, possibly explaining the lower scores seen in the Talent Hub results. Additionally, Talent Hub customers more frequently measure the rejected after application touch point. So this is the touch point when candidates are rejected immediately after applying. We see generally lower scores at this touch point. Okay, they hear us. Yes. Mark, they're hearing you on Mark's mic.
I'm back.
Right. All right. Great. All right. If I mute my mic, is everything, you guys hear me through the microphone? Yes. All right, great. All right. Apologies for all the technical difficulties. We're back to the podcast setup. The mic setup failed, but it's been fixed now. So this regards to Start and Talent Hub. The rest of the report or webinar will focus only on the Start customers. The first thing I'd like to highlight is a comparison between 2022 and 2023. At the left, you see the distribution by stage for 2022, and at the right for 2023. What we see is that the trend is in general the same. However, we do see some improvements between 2023 and 2022. The median NPS in 2022 was about a -12 for rejected candidates, and that increased to -5. We also see that the NPS for the top companies, so the high end of the whisker of the box plot, increased in 2023. Likewise, we see for withdrawn a slight increase in the range, as well as for hired. So overall, we see that in 2023, candidate experience improved. So that is a great result. What we can do is then dive into the rejected touch point. As Mark mentioned, we measure 4 different stages among rejected candidates: rejected after application, after phone screen, after assessment, and after the interview. What we find is that candidates who reach the interview stage are most positive. They, on average, have an NPS of 0. But what we also see here is that the range is rather large. So if we look at the whiskers of the box plot, we see that some companies have NPS scores as low as -50, and others have NPS scores of up to 50. So scoring an NPS of 50 among rejected candidates is very impressive. But what this tells us is that there's very large differences. So although on average candidates who reach interview stage are positive, there are very large differences between companies, and it's still very easy to do well or poorly here. Also, what we see here is that candidates who are rejected after an assessment have particularly low NPS scores, with on average a -26. Also, what we see is that even the best companies only score just above a 0 on candidates who are rejected after assessment. So the takeaway here that you need to be very considerate about if and when you want to use an assessment in the hiring process, because if candidates are rejected at this stage, that will have a large impact on the overall candidate experience. Moving on, we can zoom in to the NPS and break it down by country. Right now, for the webinar, we're only going to be looking at rejected candidates, but in the benchmark report itself, you'll be able to see the data for other touch points as well. In this case, what we're looking at is the country where the candidate is located when they complete the survey. This is data we collect from the IP address when they complete the candidate experience survey. And if we look at rejected candidates, one thing stands out. The candidates, for whatever reason, from the United Arab Emirates are particularly positive. And once again, these are rejected candidates. They score the experience with a +12, whereas all other countries score in the negative range. The worst scoring countries are 3 European countries, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Germany, or Ireland with a -12, Germany -17, and the Netherlands -20. What we see also is that the United States is in the middle with a -10. So this is a consistent finding that US candidates are frequently more positive than their European counterparts. Next, another way to break down the data is by company size. What we see is that, what we see here is for 2023 and 2022. At the top, you see the numbers for 2022, and at the bottom at the top for 2023 and at the bottom for 2022. We broke down companies in the benchmark into 4 buckets: those with less than 500 employees, those with 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, and 5,000 and more. And we've broken it down by stage. So we see in purple, rejected, in yellow, withdrawn, and in green, hired. What we see, consistent with last year, is that smaller companies have better candidate experience. For those candidates that were rejected in 2023, we saw scores of -3 and 1 for small companies versus 2022 of -3 and 9. Another way to break down the data is by department. So what we do is from the job titles that candidates apply for, we try to identify the department that they belong to. We've broken it down into 8 different departments. And what you see here at the left is, first off, the overall candidate experience by department, and at the right, only for rejected candidates. So the overall candidate NPS is including rejected, hired, and withdrawn candidates. And what we see there is that people applying for jobs in shopping and retail are particularly positive, scoring the overall experience with a +45. At the bottom, we see engineering, product, and data with an 11, and marketing at the bottom with a 7. Interestingly, though, if we look only at rejected candidates, we see that shopping and retail also scores lowest with a -21. Engineering, product, and data scores with a -11, and marketing scores with -20. So the question is, how can it be that shopping and retail scores overall largest, but also scores lowest with the rejected candidates? Here we can understand the importance of actually zooming in to the data. What we see here at the right, again broken down by department, is the percent of candidates that were rejected or hired by department. And what we see at the bottom, shopping and retail, that 2/3 of candidates are hired. So this explains why the overall NPS is so high, but can be so positive for rejected candidates. Because so many are being hired, the hired NPS score is playing a very large role in the overall statistic, as opposed to, for example, marketing, engineering, product, and data, where we see only 4 to 11% are hired. So once again, just to stress the importance of zooming in to the different touch points to better understand the candidate experience. Lastly, we'll be breaking down the NPS by source. Here you see the most popular sources. What we see is that the career page, which attracts the majority of candidates, has an NPS score of -8, and referrals score positively, even though they were rejected, with a 5, and internal applicants a score of +10. We see Indeed scores particularly low with an NPS of -19 among rejected candidates. At the right, we have the source breakdown. So this is, we have two columns. Firstly, the source breakdown. The source breakdown shows you what percent of candidates are coming through a particular source. And in the 2023 data, we found that 47% were sourced through the career page. About 5% were referrals, 1% were internal applicants, and about 3% from LinkedIn ads. We also had a look at what percent were actually hired. So what we saw is that of the candidates sourced through the career page, 5% were hired, and referrals 23.7%, and internal applicants 51%. Interestingly, also for Indeed, a very high hired percentage with 23%. These numbers actually have changed a lot with respect to 2022. At the left, you see the numbers for 2022, and at the right for 2023. If we look at first the source breakdown, what we saw in 2022 was that 34.5% came through the career page, whereas in 2023, that grew to 47%. Of course, this increase came at the cost of almost all other sources. We see that referrals dropped from almost 11% down to 5%, LinkedIn ads from 9.8% to 3.3%. Also, what we see across the board is that the percent of hired candidates decreased. For example, for the career page, we saw that 19% were hired in 2022, and that dropped to 5%. Likewise for referrals, from almost 40% down to 23%. To help understand why we saw a drop in the hired ratios across all sources, what we've done here is broken down the ratio between hired and rejected candidates per company. So here, what you see, and you see it per month going back to January 2022. If you just eyeball the purple bars, the number of hired candidates per company, you see that this has remained rather consistent over the course of the 2 years. But what you see starting September 2022 or October 2022 is the number of rejected candidates has drastically increased. You see a pop in the green bars. This suggests that there are more candidates applying for the same number of roles, explaining why we across all sources see a drop in the percent of hired candidates. Now, this concludes the MPS insights for the webinar. Once again, all of the numbers and more can be found in the benchmark report itself.
Maybe touch on a few questions.
Yeah.
Before we go to the.
Yeah, there's some questions. Can you hear Mark all right?
I think they do. So first of all, the last slide you showed is maybe also already an indication that unemployment is starting to shift a little bit, more applications per role. But one of the questions is about the assessment and why that is scoring low. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, a question about why the assessment is scoring low. Yeah, the assessment, of course, is a very difficult thing. It's very time consuming for candidates. They may need to spend multiple hours to conduct an assessment. And then frequently they are may complain that they do not receive any feedback if they've been refused. Mark, I believe you need to mute.
Coming to your side.
Okay. All right. Are there more questions you would like to?
Do you think it is so when there's an improvement, do you think it is because customers were using the data on candidate experience analytics?
Yeah, either the companies are doing it intrinsically very well, or they're drawing conclusions from what they're finding in the numbers. Most frequently, it just boils down to companies needing to give quicker responses with better feedback. And of course, being more considerate of a candidate's time. Shall we move on to the response rate?
Yeah.
Great. All right, response rates. This is something we didn't include in last year's report, but we had many questions about. So we're happy to share these numbers with you here today and also in the report tomorrow. Firstly, what we see here is the response rates broken down by touch points. So you see in purple the 4 rejected touch points we measure, in yellow withdrawn, and in green hired. What we see is firstly, looking at the rejected touch points, the response rates are as low as, on average, 16% for rejected after application, and as high as 29% for candidates rejected after interview, 23% for withdrawn candidates, and 52% for hired candidates. What's interesting here is the range is very large. So we see companies have response rates as low as 5% and as high as 50% for rejected candidates. We'll dive into some possible reasons for that, but understand that it can vary a lot. Also, what we see in the rejected candidates is very clearly that those rejected after application, so right after submitting their survey CVs, and being rejected, have a almost half the response rate as those that reach the interview stage. These candidates obviously have spent very little time or are maybe conducting multiple interviews and will not respond to every survey that they receive. I tried to get an understanding of what could be the possible causes of low response rates. My first hypothesis was, is this related to the number of invitations that companies are sending out? So what you see at the chart at the left is just a scatter plot showing the number of invitations a company sent and what response rate they achieved. Along the bottom axis is the number of invitations sent. So at the right of it, you see that there are companies sending upwards of 10,000 to 20,000 invitations and still achieving response rates of 20 to 30%. Likewise, there are companies with less invitations also achieving high response rates. So the response rate is independent of the number of invitations being sent. A more likely explanation of response rates is the job or departments that are being hired for. If we break down the response rates by department, we see at the bottom, shop and retail have very low response rates compared to all other departments. Shop and retail, of course, are the non-office workers, and those have higher volumes of applicants, but apparently these have less interest in completing candidate experience surveys.
Yeah, maybe good to add here is that retail, of course, has so much volume in terms of candidates that even a lower response rate still gives you enough data, or our customers enough data, to make proper analyses.
I want to share a few more insights just in terms of possible ways to, or some considerations concerning response rates. Start customers are able to send out a reminder email. And what I found surprising is that about 1/3 of the responses received are received following the sending of the reminder email. So assume that you had a 20% response rate. But on the initial email, this means that sending a reminder email will increase your response rate by an additional 10%. So that reminder email about 6 days after the initial one can make a very big difference in the number of responses collected. What's also very interesting is how quickly candidates respond to the survey emails. So what you see here along the x-axis is the number of hours after an invitation has been sent. And along the y-axis is what percent of all responses you've collected in X hours. So let's say that you were to receive 100 responses to a particular survey. What we see is that 30% of those, or 30 in this case, are collected within a single hour. So 1 hour after the invitation is sent, already 30% will have replied. Within a day, 60% of candidates will have already responded. So candidates are very quick, probably in many cases, meaning that they're answering their, filling in these surveys on their phones. What's also very interesting is that the initial responses are much more extreme. So what you see here is the running NPS, again, in the hours following the sending of a survey. At some point, this plateaus to the final NPS score. But what you see is that the initial responses, in this case for rejected candidates, is much more negative. So the candidates, so if we look specifically at rejected candidates that complete a survey in the hour or in the day, in the first 24 hours after receiving a survey, will generally give lower NPS scores. And then over time, this NPS increases.
And what do you see for let's say, the happy side of this, the candidate hired?
Yeah. So interestingly, we see actually, so we don't show this here, but we see the opposite effect. For hired candidates, we see also a more extreme response. We see hence the responses received from hired candidates in the first hours are more positive, and then slowly the NPS score tapers down. So what this suggests is that it's important to consider how many days you want to wait before you send out your surveys. And based on this, a recommendation would be for rejected candidates to maybe wait a couple of days to let the emotions settle, whereas maybe for hired candidates, sending it out sooner, because, well, if you want to have a very positive NPS score, or also waiting a couple of days if you want to have a more neutral and possibly less subjective NPS score. That concludes the response rate insights. Lastly, actually we have two more things. We'll be looking at comment insights and afterwards at the hiring manager insights.
And maybe before we continue, jump on that question that is asking what are best practices to implement and drive response rates? Well, one has been given, that is wait a little bit for emotions to settle. Program a reminder is super important. That adds a lot to your response rates. Also using a custom sending domain, so everybody will recognize it as it's coming from your company. Also announcing that a survey will be sent, on outcome of a process. So all those little bits help getting a good score.
Great. I want to be mindful of time. I see we have we're 45 minutes in. We have to cover the comment insights, the hiring manager insights, and leave some room for Q&A. So I'm going to do my best to get through this. I understand the technical difficulties have obviously led to delays. Comments, of course, are very qualitative. We can look at some example positive comments. The recruiter was very positive, or there was a lot of clarity around the procedure. And likewise, we have negative comments. People did not feel respected. They were ghosted. They didn't know how to prepare. Of course, this is very difficult to make sense of. And for this, it's possible to quantify it. We can do this in a few ways. Firstly, we can do this by assigning each comment a sentiment. Through machine learning, we can say whether a comment was positive because of the use of good words or negative, or maybe just simply neutral. Once comments have sentiment, we can calculate an overall sentiment score, which is calculated similarly to the NPS score. It is the percent of positive comments minus the percent of negative comments. And I'll share a little bit of numbers on that. And we can also generate labels just based on trying to identify what the comment is about. So for example, comments may be about the company and the brand, the feedback, the process, and so forth. So to give an understanding of what candidates are talking about, we can first look at what are candidates talking about. So if we look at all of the 100,000 plus collected comments collected in 2023, we see that 25% of these were about the process, 20% were about feedback, and 16-70% were about communication and the recruitment team. We can dive into this, and if we look at who is it that is, for example, talking about feedback, so what we see here is by topic, what percent of the comments are coming from rejected, withdrawn, or hired candidates. What stands out here are particularly feedback and preparation and assignment are the topics mostly discussed by rejected candidates. You see that for feedback, 91% of the time that feedback is mentioned, it is mentioned by rejected candidates. Likewise, for preparation and assignment, 88% of the time that this is mentioned, it's mentioned by a rejected candidate. So what we can also do is dive into it a little bit further. So if we focus only on the rejected candidates or comments by rejected candidates, and again break it down by topic, and then break it down one step further by detractor, passive, or promoter, we again see that feedback is mainly discussed by rejected detractors, whereas passive and promoters mention it much less frequently. The same goes for preparation and assignment. So again, without even having looked at actual comments, we can already see that it's mainly detractors who are rejected who mention feedback. And we can highlight the importance of feedback. If we just look at, in some cases, customers will ask a question about feedback received. And what we see is there's a very strong correlation between the feedback rating given and the NPS score, just highlighting the relationship between these two and the importance of providing good feedback and what it can do to convert a possible detractor to hopefully a passive or a promoter. Last slide for the comment analysis. Here we show the sentiment score. So at the left, what you see is the sentiment score for all of the touch points measured. What stands out here is that comments in the rejected after phone screen have a sentiment score of -25. So we can zoom in to that at the right. And what we can see is the breakdown of topics for candidates who were rejected after phone screen. We see that the majority of the time that the negative comments revolve around feedback. So candidates rejected after phone screen maybe had a reasonable experience, but they provide a lot of negative comments concerning the feedback received and possibly being unclear why they were rejected. So this was just two examples of how comment analysis can be used to just make sense of the mountains of comment data that you may have. Lastly, the hiring manager insights. I think
the moment everybody has been waiting for.
Yeah, hopefully it's everything they've been waiting for. This will be a report that we'll publish later in the year. This will not be in tomorrow's benchmark report, but just to show you some results. The hiring manager survey consists of 5 questions. It's a NPS question, and then 4 questions to rate the recruiter, the kickoff meeting, the candidates, and the recruitment process. So just overall, one thing we see is that you all are doing a great job. We see on average, the hiring managers score the cooperation with the recruitment teams about a 75. So this is a great result. We do, however, see that the range is very large, with some companies having their hiring managers score the cooperation as low as an 11 and as high as a 91. If we look at the questions asked, we see that overall the scores are rather high, with on average 9.2, with the exception of the candidates. The candidates are scored an 8.8. What hiring managers would like to see is that the candidates have a better understanding of the role, or that there's a more diverse pool. Compared to 2022, however, we do see an improvement. We see across the board that the scores have increased, but also consistent with 2022, candidates scored lowest. And once again, for this, we'll be publishing a report later in the year with more details around the hiring manager satisfaction. Lastly, to recap, candidate experience varies across all the dimensions we shared: region, department, company size, and countries. It has improved compared to 2022, and the trends are largely consistent. For example, we saw that small companies had better candidate experience than large ones. We saw large differences between companies. So this highlighted by the box plots that we showed, that the ranges were very frequently very large. And lastly, comments are a gold mine, and using comment analysis can provide really unique insights that complement the NPS scores. And with that, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I see that there are a whole bunch.
A number of questions. I've been watching them carefully. One is very simple to answer. Aman suggested that it would be a best practice to send a separate feedback request to a candidate, as opposed to including a link in let's say, an application verification email. And that's very true. So at Start, we send a separate feedback invitation request, already including the first question in the email. So people don't want to take surveys. People don't want to participate in research. People do want to give their opinion, as we've seen in the high response rates. So if that ultimate question, like, would you recommend this company to apply with, is already in the email, you'll get a very high response rates. So that is a best practice. Another one, typically for you, Chris, is about the comment analysis. Kalina is really happy with it, but is asking, are we working on improving that comment analysis dashboard?
Yes. Yeah. So right now, I think the comment analysis, I think that's where, of course, there is tons of value, and we haven't fully extracted that yet. We're continuing to work on this. I don't think it is being worked on currently. I don't think we have a date yet, but we are going to be elaborating the comment analysis, both in terms of accuracy as well as the insights available. So that's something that you can look forward to.
Another topic is the perceived paradox in what we said with regards to talent shortage and the fact that maybe more candidates are applying now for the same roles. Personally, I think that the big overarching trend is still talent shortage. And what we see is a very small indication of maybe a little bit of change in that, which is maybe the dropping vacancy rates and also more applications per role. Not major, but just a little bit an indication of change within the larger shortage of talent environment. I would position it like that.
Other questions. Let me see. How do you separate the negative responses from just not getting the job versus the true reflection of the interview feedback experience? Not sure I understand this question.
Yeah, well, part of it is that we don't, because ultimately when a candidate is rejected, we get a lower net promoter score. So that is factored in. And that's why also benchmarks are so important. So to compare it like for like, to do, let's say, filter out the emotion as much as you can, just give it a few days before you send out a feedback request, but also ask for follow-up questions and not just that one question, but of course be as factual as possible in asking questions, and then people will also be, less emotional, but you cannot ultimately completely factor it out. Maybe time for one or two more. I think the department question is interesting. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about departments? I think it's a grouping of job roles.
Yeah, exactly. So the department is what department is a candidate applying for. So, for example, a developer will apply for a job in the engineering and product and data department, as we've classified it, or a marketing person will apply for something in the marketing department. So this is just based on to what department is someone applying. Of course, each company will have different department names. One may call it R&D, another may call it product and data, another may call it engineering. But so we've done is just to create a generic grouping of that and to make it comparable.
Cool. Very interesting question by Anastasia, asking which portion of our customers do measure hiring manager satisfaction. That is a majority. So I would say 2/3 of our customers are measuring that. But more importantly, how does it affect their overall NPS journey? I think that's an interesting hypothesis to look into, because indeed, when you involve your hiring manager in this process more closely, of course, your overall NPS, also from a candidate point of view, could be influenced positively. That is at least the suggestion I'm getting from this question. So watch the space for our hiring manager report maybe later in the year, when we might be able to check that hypothesis.
A question from Joanna concerning, do you have any data on how the response rates improved for companies transitioning from Talent Hub to Start? Very interestingly, we did compare the response rates between the two platforms, and we see an opportunity to actually combine the best of both worlds. What we found was that Start had higher response rates in candidates completing the response, but Talent Hub had a better response rate when looking within the survey, so from question to question. So we are working on a new survey that will combine the best of both worlds and ultimately result in higher overall response rates.
So with that, we'd like to close on time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for keeping watching, even during the audio issues. If you're interested in learning more, there's even a button over there. We thank you for joining today. Hope you have a great candidate and can provide a great candidate experience throughout 2024. And if you have questions, please reach out, connect with us, and we'll also get back to people whose question has not been fully answered right now. And again, thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.